The morning Caleb Marsh found the alien girl sitting in his irrigation ditch. He was already having the worst week of his life. The tractor had thrown a belt on Monday. The co-op had rejected his grain sample on Tuesday, moisture content 2 points too high, which meant he'd have to run it through the dryer again and eat the cost. On Wednesday, his neighbor Don Hessler had told him, with the particular satisfaction of a man delivering bad news he's waited 3 days to share, that the county had received a federal relocation petition for 30 square kilometers of prime farmland east of the Platte River Basin, which included every single acre Caleb had inherited from his father, who had inherited it from his father, who had broken the sod himself with a team of horses in the spring of 1887. Thursday had been the hearing. Caleb had sat in the back of the Millard County Civic Hall and listened to men in good suits explain, with slides and charts and a great deal of nodding, that the Interplanetary Resettlement Authority needed agricultural demonstration land for incoming refugee populations from the Vorathi scatter, a term that apparently referred to the explosion of a small star system 3 years ago that had scattered several million aliens across settled space. The men in suits called it a humanitarian crisis. They called the requisition a temporary arrangement. They used the word partnership approximately 47 times. Caleb had counted. He had not spoken at the hearing. He was not a man who spoke at hearings. He was a man who got up at 4:30 in the morning and worked until his hands stopped working, and he had assumed that this was enough of a credential. It turned out it was not. He had driven home in the dark, eaten a cold sandwich standing at the kitchen counter, and gone to bed without showering, which he never did. And now it was Friday morning, 5:22 by the green numbers on his bedside clock, and there was something in the irrigation ditch. He had heard it from inside the house, a sound like someone sorting through broken glass very carefully, followed by a long silence, followed by a small, sharp sound that he eventually identified as crying. Caleb pulled on his boots without untying them, took the flashlight from the kitchen drawer, and walked out into the pre-dawn dark. The ditch ran along the eastern edge of his property, about 40 meters from the house. It was dry this time of year, October, too late in the season for the irrigation schedule, and it held maybe 30 centimeters of standing water from the last rain. It was not a comfortable place to be, even in good weather. He found her because the flashlight caught her eyes first. 2 reflective discs in the dark, greenish gold, very large, blinking slowly at him from the bottom of the ditch. He stopped. The eyes blinked again. He lowered the flashlight slightly so he wasn't shining it directly in her face, or what he assumed was her face, based on the eyes, and waited for his own heart to slow down. What he could see in the indirect glow, she was small. She was sitting in the shallow water with her knees drawn up to her chest. She had what he initially took for dark hair, though it moved slightly in ways that hair did not in the wind because there wasn't any but on its own in small, slow ripples. Her skin was a deep purple gray, the color of a bruise going yellow, and her fingers, which were wrapped around her knees, had too many joints in them. She was looking at him. He said, "You hurt." She kept looking at him. He tried the Universal Translator app on his phone. He downloaded it 2 years ago when the first resettlement waves had started coming through the county, mostly out of the vague sense that he should. He'd never actually used it. He held the phone up and said again, "Are you hurt?" The app produced a sound like a cat walking on piano keys. Then it waited. The girl in the ditch made a sound back at it, something with too many consonants and a falling tone at the end. The app said, "I do not understand. I am trying to be small." Caleb considered this. Then he climbed down into the ditch. She flinched back hard when he came down, pressed herself against the far wall of the ditch, which put her underwater to the waist, and he stopped immediately and held very still and said, through the translator, "I'm not going to touch you. I'm just going to sit here for a minute." The app rendered this as the piano cat sound again. The girl stared at him. Then slowly, she stopped pressing herself against the wall. She was young. He didn't know enough about her species to say how young, but the proportions were off in the way that proportions are always off when something is still growing. Too much forehead, too much eye, limbs that hadn't quite caught up to themselves. Her clothes, if they were clothes, were more like a single piece of dark material that had been wrapped around her in a way that suggested she'd done it herself, imperfectly, in the dark. She was covered in mud, so was he now. He held up the phone again. "My name is Caleb, I live in that house," he pointed. "What's your name?" The app went through its translation process. She listened to it with the focused attention of someone trying very hard to understand something in a foreign language. Then she made a series of sounds. The app said, "I am called Vessel 13th Pale in the count of my clutch mother's giving. You may shorten this." He thought about it. "Pale," he said. "Can I call you Pale?" The app translated. She made a short sound. "This is acceptable." "Okay," he said. "Pale, are you hurt?" She looked at her hands for a moment, then at her leg. He followed her eyes and saw, above the waterline, that her left leg had a long gash across the outer shin, purple dark blood, already clotting into something that looked like dark resin, but still oozing. "Right," he said. He climbed back out of the ditch. He went back to the house, got the first aid kit, a towel and a blanket. He came back. He sat back down in the water, which was cold enough that he winced, and he held out the towel toward her. She looked at the towel, then at him, then at the towel again. He put it on the ditch wall between them and didn't touch it again. After about 45 seconds, she picked it up herself. It took about 20 minutes, working slowly and with a lot of pauses, to establish that she would allow him to look at the wound, not touch it, just look. It was about 15 centimeters long, not deep. Whatever had made it was sharp. She didn't want him to apply anything to it, which was probably fine. He didn't know enough about alien physiology to be sure the antiseptic wipes wouldn't cause some kind of reaction anyway. What he could establish over the course of that 20 minutes was that she was not going to tell him how she had gotten here or where she had come from. Every time the app translated a question about that, she made a sound the app rendered as asterisk. "I do not know this topic." Whether this was a lie or the literal truth, he couldn't tell. What he could establish was that she was very cold and had been in the ditch for some time and had no obvious destination. "Come inside," he said through the app. "Get warm, I'll make food, then we can figure out what to do next." She looked at him for a long time. In the growing pre-dawn light he could see her face more clearly now, the wide-set eyes, the flat planes of her cheekbones, the way her mouth was a little too wide for her face. He noticed that the rippling hair-like material had gone still and was pressed flat against her head the way that a dog's ears go flat when it is frightened and trying to make itself seem smaller. He did not comment on this. She said something. The app said, "I have been told that humans from agricultural zones keep weapons to kill those who approach their land." He thought about how to answer that honestly. "I have a shotgun," he said. "It's in the house. I use it for coyotes. I don't have any plans to use it on you." The app translated. She considered. "You did not bring it when you came to the ditch." "No," he said. "I heard someone crying. You don't bring a gun towards something that's crying." There was a longer pause than usual. The app didn't have anything to translate because she didn't say anything. She just looked at him with those large, still, gold-green eyes. Then she stood up slowly and climbed out of the ditch. He gave her the downstairs bathroom to clean up. He put a set of his old work clothes outside the door. They would be comically large on her, but they would be warm and dry. He went to the kitchen and started coffee and stood at the stove thinking about what he knew about Vorathi biology, which was almost nothing, and what he had in the house that might be edible for someone who was not human. He had eggs. He had oatmeal. He had about 6 different kinds of canned soup, because he was a single man in his late 30s who had not made much progress on cooking since his mother died. He had a bag of dried fruit he'd bought at the co-op last spring and never opened. He didn't know if any of these things would be safe for her or terrible for her. He made oatmeal for himself and left a selection of things on the table: the dried fruit, crackers, a jar of peanut butter, an apple, and hoped she could figure out what was safe to smell or touch or taste. She came out of the bathroom wearing his work shirt and a pair of sweatpants that she'd somehow cinched around herself using what appeared to be a strip of her old wrapping material. The hair-like material was damp and moving again, which he was starting to interpret as something like alert calm versus the frightened flat position. She stood in the doorway of the kitchen and looked at the food on the table. He said through the app, "I don't know what's safe for you to eat. You should check before you try anything." She walked to the table and bent over each item in turn, hovering her face close without touching, and then pointed at the apple and the crackers. He nodded. She sat down, picked up the apple, and bit into it with slightly more teeth than he had expected. He sat across from her and ate his oatmeal, and they sat in silence, while the sky outside the kitchen window turned from black to dark blue to the particular gray-pink of an October dawn over flat country. After a while he said, "How old are you?" The app translated. She made a long, complicated sound. The app said, "I have completed 4 cycles of the long count. This is perhaps equivalent in developmental stage to your word child or your word young. I am not certain of the precise translation." He had guessed roughly right then. She was young, not an infant, not an adult, somewhere in the difficult middle, old enough to be frightened and alone and trying to manage both of those things without help, young enough that it showed. He said, "Is there somewhere you're supposed to be, someone who's looking for you?" Long pause. Then, "There was a place where I was assigned. There was a coordinator. I do not know if the coordinator is still looking. I left the assigned place several days ago." "Why?" Shorter pause. "The assigned place was not safe." He didn't push on that. He had heard enough over the past 2 years about the resettlement camps to know that "not safe" could mean 100 different things, some of them bureaucratic and some of them much worse. "Are you in danger right now?" he asked. "Is someone looking for you who wants to hurt you?" She thought about this very carefully. "I do not think they would send someone after a single vessel 13th. I am not a resource worth chasing. I think I am simply lost." He nodded. He drank his coffee. The sun was fully up now, pale October sun coming in low through the window and making a rectangle of light on the kitchen floor. He had things to do today. The grain needed to run through the dryer. The tractor belt needed replacing. He had to make a call to a county commissioner who owed him a favor and probably couldn't do anything about the requisition, but needed to know where Caleb stood. He looked at the alien girl sitting across his kitchen table, eating crackers with precise, careful bites, her strange hair rippling gently in the warm kitchen air. "All right," he said. "Here's what I think should happen. You should stay here today, get some rest, get warm. We figure out what you want to do, whether you want me to contact someone, whether you want to stay somewhere, whether you have somewhere to go. We don't have to decide everything right now." The app translated. She listened. Then she said something. "Why would you do this?" He thought about it. "Because you were in my ditch," he said. "And now you're in my kitchen, and it's cold outside." He paused. "And because I don't turn people away who need help. Doesn't matter much what kind of people." She looked at him for a long time. Then she picked up another cracker. Her name, the shortened version, became pale and she stayed. This was not a thing that happened quickly or decisively. It happened the way most things happen on a farm, through a series of small, practical adjustments that each seemed reasonable in the moment, and which, looked at together, added up to something that had not been planned. The first adjustment was that she slept in the spare room that afternoon. He had made it clear she was welcome to, and had left it at that. When he came in at dusk from working on the tractor, She was asleep on top of the covers with her knees drawn up, and her hair spread across the pillow like a dark puddle. He closed the door quietly and made himself a sandwich. The second adjustment was that she was still there the next morning and the morning after that. He did not ask her to leave. She did not ask to stay because she seemed constitutionally incapable of making direct requests. She would stand near something she needed and wait to be noticed. When he finally caught on to this, he started checking. Is there anything you need? Do you want more of this? Should I get you that? And she would say yes or no through the app with the slightly startled air of someone who was not used to being asked. The third adjustment was that she started helping. He did not ask her to. He never asked her to. But she was clearly not a person who could sit still for long, and on the third day he came out of the barn to find her examining the harvested grain that was staged by the dryer, picking up individual kernels and looking at them closely, then setting them down in different arrangements. When he asked what she was doing, she made him wait while she composed a long reply. In my clutch mother's teaching, the first skill learned was assessment of seed potential. I am not certain if your grains function the same way, but several of these appear to have different moisture characteristics from the others. I was sorting them. I apologize if this is incorrect behavior. He looked at the sorted piles she'd made. Then he got out his moisture meter and checked several samples from each pile. She had sorted them accurately. How did you do that? He asked. I can sense the difference with my handling sense. I am not sure what you call this in your language. It is a chemical awareness in the skin. He thought about that. Then he said, that's incredibly useful. She made a short sound. The app rendered it as, oh. But her hair had gone very bright and active, moving in quick ripples he was starting to associate with something like surprised pleasure. The fourth adjustment was that Don Hessler stopped by. Don Hessler was 63 years old and had farmed the land adjacent to Caleb's for his entire adult life. He was not a bad man. He was, however, the primary carrier of all information between the 16 farms that made up what the county maps called the Millard Eastern Rural Cooperative, and he had an opinion about almost everything, and shared it with the efficiency of a man who had been doing so for decades. He came by on a Wednesday afternoon in the pretense of returning a borrowed chain wrench. Caleb saw the truck from the barn and came out to meet him in the driveway, which did not prevent Dawn from seeing Pale through the kitchen window, where she was sitting at the table, working through a stack of moisture-reading logs he'd given her to organize. Dawn accepted the return of his pretense wrench and then said very casually, "That one of the settler folk." "Her name is Pale," Caleb said. "Uh-huh." Dawn looked at the window again. "How long's she been here?" "About a week." "You call the IRA?" "Not yet." Dawn looked at him. "Caleb." "She's not ready for that," Caleb said. "She had a bad experience in a resettlement facility. She'll go when she's ready." "You know they've got protocols," Dawn said. "They've got to know where their people are. Somebody could be looking for her." "Nobody's looking for her," Caleb said. "I asked." Dawn was quiet for a moment. He looked at the kitchen window again. Then he said, "She's real young, isn't she?" "Yes." "And you're on your own out here." Caleb looked at him evenly. "I know what you're not saying. Don't say it." Dawn had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. "I'm just saying how it looks." "It looks like a man who found a lost kid in a ditch and didn't throw her back," Caleb said. "You need anything else while you're here?" Dawn left without taking a position on anything, which meant he would be distributing the story to everyone within 48 hours without Caleb's interpretation attached. Pale had come to stand in the kitchen doorway while this happened. She had clearly been able to hear even if she couldn't understand the words. When Don's truck pulled away down the road, she said something. "That man does not like me being here." "He doesn't know what to think about it," Caleb said. "There's a difference." "Is it a problem for you?" "That he does not like it." Caleb thought about this seriously, which she seemed to appreciate. He had noticed she could tell when he was thinking versus when he was just making sounds. "It's a complication," he said honestly. "People around here aren't used to things they don't understand. Some of them will decide to not like it. Some of them will come around. Most of them will just watch and wait and see what happens." She absorbed this. "Then what do you want to happen?" He hadn't expected that question. He thought about it for a moment. "I want you to be okay," he said. "I want to figure out what the right next step is for you, not for anyone else, for you." He paused. "What do you want to happen?" She was quiet for a long time. The hair went very still. "Then I want to not be afraid, for a while, if that is possible." "Yeah," he said, "I think that's possible." October rolled into November. The corn was in. The grain situation had been resolved, partially, expensively, with 4 phone calls and a meeting Caleb drove 2 hours each way to attend. The requisition was still moving through the federal process, but a local rights attorney named Diane Quo had taken an interest in the case and was looking at an easement challenge, which meant it was at least no longer moving unchallenged. Pale learned the translator app faster than he had expected, and then, after about 2 weeks, started picking up English words directly. Not fluently, not grammatically, but enough that conversations became shorter and less dependent on the app's mediocre rendering. She said yes and no, and I understand. And this is wrong, pointing at errors in his record keeping, accurately. And that one is ready, pointing at grain samples, also accurately, and cold, and enough. And after about 3 weeks, Caleb, which she pronounced with an extra syllable somewhere in the middle that made it sound like a word from a different language that happened to mean his name. She asked him questions through the app when the questions were complicated. What does this word mean? Why does this machine work this way? How do you know when the soil is ready? What happened to the people who lived here before you lived here? What is in that old building at the far end of the east field? That last one he answered by walking her out there. It was a root cellar his grandfather had built, half collapsed now, the door hanging off one hinge. Inside, in the cold dark, there were old jars and broken tools and a shelf that had fallen sideways, and on the far wall, carved into the sandstone with a nail or a chisel, were the names of his grandfather's children, 5 of them, in a row, with dates. 4 of the dates were very close together, within a span of 2 years. She asked what the dates meant. He explained. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "Asterisk the same sickness." "Probably," he said. "We don't know for certain. They didn't write it down." She looked at the names for a long time. Then she said through the app, "Were they afraid?" "I don't know," he said. "I hope not." She made a sound he had not heard before, low and resonant, that the app didn't attempt to translate. It felt like something between a lament and a question. They walked back to the house in the dark and neither of them talked, but she walked closer to him than usual, close enough that her shoulder was nearly against his arm, and he didn't move away. The first time anyone from town saw Pale directly was mid-November, when Caleb had to go to the feed store, and she came with him, because she had decided that the inside of the truck was acceptable, and the outside world was slightly less unacceptable than it had been, and she wanted to see more of it. She sat in the passenger seat and watched the landscape go by with the attentive stillness of someone cataloging everything. When they got to town, she stayed close to his side and kept her hair very flat, which he now knew was her method of making herself less visible, and most people either didn't look directly at her or pretended they hadn't. Martha Ellison, who ran the feed store with her husband and had known Caleb since he was 7 years old, was not most people. She came around the counter when they came in, looked at Pale for a moment with her sharp, bird-like eyes, and then said, "Is this the young woman Don Hessler's been going on about?" "Probably," Caleb said. Martha looked at Pale. "My name is Martha," she said clearly and slowly, though not the particular slow that was condescending, the slow that is just clear. "I hear your name is Pale." Pale looked at Caleb briefly. He gave a small nod. Pale looked back at Martha. "Yes," she said in English, "I am Pale." Martha nodded, with the air of someone confirming a thing she had suspected. "Are you eating all right? Caleb's a good farmer, but he's a terrible cook." Pale looked at Caleb again. Her hair moved. "I have improved," Caleb said with some dignity. "He has learned the potato," Pale said. Martha laughed, a real laugh, startled out of her. Pale's hair went into rapid motion, which Caleb now recognized as the equivalent of a grin. It was not everything, and it did not fix anything. 3 people in the parking lot watched them from a distance with expressions that were not friendly. Someone had apparently called the IRA regional office to report an unregistered alien presence in the county, which resulted in a form letter being sent to Caleb's address asking him to report to an intake coordinator. He threw the letter away. But Martha Ellison, who had deep roots in the county and a sharper sense of human decency than most of the people who thought they were more sophisticated than her, had laughed at Pale's joke. And this, in the particular social ecosystem of a small rural county, was not a small thing. The question that changed things was not the one he expected. It was a Thursday in late November, cold and gray and threatening snow. They were in the barn. Pale had taken to spending time in the barn, apparently, because the smell of it reminded her of something from her homeworld that she couldn't quite explain, and she found it calming. She sat on a hay bale while Caleb worked on the hydraulics of the old combine, and they had been quiet for a long time. Then she said, through the app, in that careful, composed way she used when the question had been sitting in her for a while, "Can a monster be a papa?" He stopped working. He set down his wrench. He turned to look at her. She was looking at a point somewhere between him and the floor, and her hair was very still. He said, "What do you mean by monster?" She made a complicated sound. The app took a moment with it. "In the stories told among my clutch kind, there are beings called monsters. They are the ones who were not chosen, who were not wanted, who exist outside the circle of those who are recognized. Among my people, this is a social category. It is not about shape or frightening appearance. It is about not belonging." He sat down on an upturned bucket. "Okay," he said, "and who are the papas in these stories?" "The papas are the ones who stay, who choose to remain, who do not leave when it is difficult. In the stories, a monster cannot be a papa because a monster has not been chosen and so cannot choose. The circle is closed to them." A pause. "But in the stories I was told when I was very small, which were not the same stories as the others told, the monster sometimes breaks the circle, by staying anyway, without being asked, without being chosen." He thought about this for a while. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the barn door in its frame. "Are you asking if I'm a monster?" he said. "No," a pause. "I am asking in your understanding if it is possible for a person who has been outside the circle to become someone who chooses to stay, for that to be valid, recognized." He thought about it seriously. He took his time. She waited. "I think," he said finally, "that in the only understanding that matters, which is the real world, not stories, the choosing is the whole thing. The circle you're talking about is just a story people tell about who's allowed. But in the actual world, the staying is what makes you a papa, not the permission." She was quiet for a long time. "Then were you chosen?" He thought about that too. His father, who had not been demonstrative but who had gotten up at 4:30 every morning for 40 years to take care of a piece of land so that Caleb could inherit it. His mother, who had died of a fast cancer when he was 24 and who had, in the last week, asked him to promise to keep the farm going, and who had done so not because she doubted he would, but because she wanted him to have the thing of having been asked. "Yeah," he said, "I was chosen." "By your parents?" "Yes." "What if there are no parents?" He looked at her. She was still looking at the same spot between him and the floor. The hair was very still, but along the edges he could see the faintest movement, the kind of movement you see in water when something just under the surface shifts. He said slowly, "Then I think someone else has to do the choosing, and it's just as valid." She looked up at him. The hair moved, not the fast, bright rippling of surprised pleasure. Something slower, something that moved in long, quiet waves, the way water moves on a deep lake far from any shore. He said, pale, "Are you asking me something?" She looked at him for a long time. Then in English without the app. "I am asking," she said carefully, "if you would stay, not because someone asked, because you choose." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind was coming under the barn door now, and the temperature in the barn had dropped, and somewhere across the fields the first dusting of snow was beginning to fall. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "I haven't been going anywhere. I was here when you were in the ditch, and I'll be here when you get up tomorrow morning." She looked at him. "That's not an answer," she said. "Yeah, it is," he said. "It's just a practical one, instead of a theoretical one." She made a sound. The app which she'd left running out of habit translated it as humans. The tone, he was fairly certain, was fond. December brought snow, and with it something unexpected, other aliens. Not many, 3, all from the regional resettlement center 60 kilometers north, all connected in some network of relationship or obligation that Caleb didn't fully understand, but which seemed to involve Pale in a way that was both a responsibility and a comfort. One of them, a large, slow-moving creature that communicated primarily through color changes in its exterior plates, turned out to be something like an older relative of Pale's. Not a parent, something between a guardian and an elder sibling, a category that didn't translate cleanly into English. This one, whose name the app rendered as Vessel Third of the Amber Count, and who Pale called simply Third, stood in Caleb's kitchen for a long time looking at him. Then it changed colors. The app said, "Asterisk, this one asks, you are the farmer who found the 13th vessel." "Yes," Caleb said. More colors. This one asks, "Why did you not report her?" "She wasn't ready. The resettlement authority requires." "I know what they require," Caleb said. "She wasn't ready. When she's ready, we'll deal with the authority." Third looked at him for a long time. The color changes were slow and deep, layered in a way that was clearly complex communication that the app was only catching part of. Then, asterisk, "This one has seen many humans in the resettlement centers. This one has not seen one who looked like you look." "How do I look?" Caleb said. "Like you are not deciding, like you have already decided." He thought about that. "Yeah," he said, "that's about right." The color changes became very slow, very deep, a single long wave of something between blue and gold. The app didn't translate it. Pale, who was watching from the doorway, made a soft sound. Later, when Third had left and the other two with him, he asked Pale what the blue-gold color had meant. She said through the app, because it was a complicated thing, "It is the color of recognition. Among my people, it is the color shown to someone who has been seen. Accurately. It does not happen often." He thought about that, then he went back to his work. January. The requisition hearing had a second date set. Diane Q had filed the easement challenge and 3 related motions, and had gotten the timeline extended. The legal work was costing money Caleb didn't quite have, but 4 other farmers in the cooperative had quietly offered to contribute, including Don Hessler, who had done so without explanation or apology, and Caleb had accepted it in the same way. Pale had, over the preceding weeks, established herself as the most accurate grain moisture assessor in the county, a thing that had happened without planning, and that resulted in 3 separate farmers from the cooperative asking, through Caleb, if she would be willing to come and assess their staged winter grain. She had agreed, with the condition, communicated through Caleb, who had communicated it with a straight face, that she would need access to their record-keeping systems as well, because assessment without record context was, in her opinion, incomplete. All three farmers had agreed. Don Hessler had been the second one to ask. He had come to the farm directly, this time without a pretense wrench, and he had stood in the kitchen and looked at Pale and said, "I hear you've got a good sense for grain." Pale had looked at Caleb, then back at Don. "Yes," she said. "I've got 800 bushels staged that the co-op won't take until moisture is confirmed. My meter's been giving me inconsistent readings. I'd appreciate it if you'd take a look." Pale looked at him for a moment with her large still eyes. Then, "I will look." Don looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at Don. Neither of them said anything about the conversation in the driveway in October. Don nodded once and Caleb nodded back, and that was enough. The night of the second requisition hearing, Caleb came home later than he expected and found Pale asleep at the kitchen table with her head on her arms and a stack of records spread around her. She had apparently been organizing his father's old rainfall logs, which he had not asked her to do, and which she had apparently decided needed doing. 3 of his grandfather's old ledgers were open and cross-referenced on the table beside them. He stood in the kitchen for a moment, in his coat with the cold still on him, looking at the table and at her, and at the records she had organized with the particular precision she brought to everything she did, each document squared with the others, each series in its own grouping. A small handwritten note in her angular script beside one group that said, in English, "Frost years, cluster, ask Caleb what caused." He stood there for a longer moment than was probably necessary. Then he went to the closet and got a blanket and put it over her shoulders without waking her, and made himself a cup of coffee, and sat across from her at the table and looked at the records she'd organized, and thought about the requisition hearing. It had gone better than expected. Diane Q had found a water rights precedent that complicated the federal claim significantly. The timeline had been pushed back further. It was not a victory, it was a postponement, but postponements had a way of becoming dismissals when the other side lost momentum. He thought about his grandfather's names carved in sandstone. He thought about the frost years in the ledger. He thought about 4:30 in the morning and what it meant to still be here. He thought about a girl in a ditch in October, trying to be small. He did not think about any of this for very long, because he was not by nature a man who sat still and thought when there were things that needed doing. But he thought about it for long enough. February, and a letter from the IRA. Not a form letter this time. A letter from a specific person, a regional resettlement coordinator named Osai Mensa, who had apparently been looking for Pale for some time and who had finally, through a chain of information that included the feed store and Don Hessler and at least one county commissioner, found where she was. The letter was formal but not hostile. It acknowledged that Pale had been placed in a resettlement center that had since been cited for a number of administrative violations. It acknowledged that her departure from that center, while technically against protocol, was understandable given the cited conditions. It asked, with some care, what Pale's current situation was and what her preferences were going forward. Caleb read the letter, then he read it again. Then he gave it to Pale, who read it through the app. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "What do you want me to do?" He said, "That's not the question. What do you want to do?" More quiet, then, "I want to stay here, if that is possible, if there is a legal way for this to be the place where I am." He said, "Let me make some calls." It took 3 weeks, 4 calls to Diane Q, 2 calls to the IRA regional office, 1 in-person meeting with Osai Mensa, who turned out to be a cautious and decent man who was navigating a system that was not designed for situations like this one, and a quantity of paperwork that Pale organized into binders with color-coded tabs and annotations in 2 languages. At the end of it, there was a document. It was not a perfect document, and it was not a permanent document, but it was a real one. And it said, in the formal language of administrative accommodation, that Pale would remain as an authorized agricultural worker and resident at the Marsh Farm property pending a permanent resettlement determination, with quarterly check-ins with the regional coordinator. Caleb read it once. Then he put it in the fireproof box where he kept the deed and the insurance documents and his parents' death certificates. He told Pale it was done. She said in English without the app, "Thank you." He said, "You were already staying. This just makes the paperwork match." She made the fond sound. The app still running in the background rendered it as humans. Spring. The east field, the one that had been under the requisition threat, was planted. Caleb had gotten up at 4:30 and been in the field by 5, and had been joined, at 5:45, by Pale, who had apparently decided that 4:30 was a reasonable time to get up, and had been getting up then without complaint for 3 months now, though she had strong opinions about the temperature of the barn at that hour, and had, without discussion, moved the barn thermometer and the small electric heater to positions she considered more rational. She was efficient. She learned fast and remembered everything, and had opinions about systems that were always worth hearing, even when they were delivered in the direct, unapologetic way that sometimes startled people who didn't know her. She had strong opinions about record-keeping, about moisture calibration, about the placement of the new grain auger that he had bought in February, and about the optimal time of day to check the eastern soil sensors, and she was right about all of them. She was also sometimes, when she thought he wasn't watching, standing in the middle of a field looking at the sky with an expression he couldn't read, not sad, not lost, something quieter than both of those, something that had no easy English word. He thought it might be the thing that happens when you have been afraid for a long time and the fear is starting to become something else. He did not comment on this. He just worked nearby and let her have it. Martha Ellison had come out twice to bring things, once food, once seeds she'd gotten from a supplier who dealt in alien-adapted agricultural varieties, and who she had apparently contacted on her own initiative, which she mentioned only in passing, and in a tone that suggested she didn't want thanks for it. Pale had spent 3 hours with the seed samples, sorting and assessing, and had written up a planting recommendation that Martha had taken back to share with 2 other farms. Don Hessler had come out to say that the legal challenge had been upgraded. The county had filed its own motion joining the easement challenge, which meant the federal authority was now facing a coalition that had more legal resources than a single farm. He had said this looking out over the field, not at Caleb, in the way that people in that county communicated things that were important without making them into a bigger thing than was comfortable. Caleb had said, "Appreciate it." Don had said, "Yep," and driven away. Pale, who had been in the barn and had come out to see who was there, watched the truck go. "Is that good?" she said in English. "Yes," he said. "Because of the field. Because of the field." She looked out over the east field, which was brown and bare still but planted now, with the first thin green just beginning to show along some of the rows in the morning light. "It would have been a waste," she said, "to lose this field." He looked at her. She was looking at the field with the same expression she used when she was assessing grain, careful, precise, fully present. "Yeah," he said, "it would have." The question Pale had asked in the barn in November became, over the following months, not a theoretical question and not an unanswered one, but a settled thing. The kind of settled that doesn't require language because language is for things that are still being determined. Third came back in April, with the 2 others from January and 4 more who Caleb had not met. They came to the farm formally, which meant they had warned Pale first and she had told Caleb, who had gotten up that morning and made coffee and put chairs in the barn because the barn, apparently, was the correct place for formal gatherings among Pale's people, a thing she had told him 2 months ago and which he had filed away without asking too many questions about. They gathered in the barn and Third changed colors for a long time, with Pale sometimes responding in colors herself. She could do this, he had learned, though she usually didn't in front of him, and sometimes relaying in English for Caleb's benefit. What the gathering was, as best he could follow, was a thing his people might have called a reckoning or a recognition, a formal acknowledgement by those who had known Pale before that her situation had changed, and that the change was good, and that it was confirmed by people who had the standing to confirm it. At the end of it, Third looked at Caleb for a long time and went through the slow, deep wave of blue gold, the recognition color. Then it made a sound. The app said, asterisk, this one says the 13th vessel is no longer 13th. Caleb looked at Pale. She looked back at him. Her hair was in the long, quiet wave, the deep lake wave. It means, she said, that the count has changed. The number was from my birth position. It is not the number I am now. He thought about that. What number are you now? She made a sound. It was a short, clear sound, single syllable, clean. The app said 1. He nodded. He looked at Third and nodded again. Third made the blue-gold wave again, and the gathering, in the way of Pale's people, was over, not with ceremony but with the simple acknowledgement of a thing that had already been true. Late May, early morning. The field was green now, really green, not the tentative first green of April but the deep, committed green of a crop that had decided to grow. Pale was in the east field when he came out. She had taken to walking the rows in the morning before the workday started, checking the soil condition with the handling sense in her fingers, which had turned out to be more accurate and considerably faster than the sensor array he'd spent $3,000 on 3 years ago. He walked out to where she was. She looked up when she heard him coming. Moisture is good, she said in English. East row's better than west. West edge may need attention in 2 weeks. I'll mark it, he said. She went back to walking the row. He fell in beside her. They walked for a while in the early morning light. The sky to the east was beginning to go from gray to the pale yellow that meant a clear day coming. The air smelled like soil and growing things, and the particular sharpness of May in this part of the country, which was not quite warm yet but was trying. After a while, Pale said, I have been thinking about the root cellar. He looked at her. Yeah. The names on the wall, the children. She was quiet for a moment. I would like to add something, if you permit it. He thought about his grandfather's names carved in sandstone, the dates that were close together. What would you add? He said. She made a sound, not the app sound, not English. A sound from her own language that was short and clear, and he couldn't repeat if he tried. What does that mean? He said. She walked 3 more steps. Then she said, it means the one who stayed. A pause. In my language, for someone who is not a bloodkin but who is still counted, who is in the circle. Another pause. I would carve it in my language under your family's names, if you permit. He walked beside her for a moment. Who are you carving it for? He said. She looked at him. In the early morning light, her eyes were very large and very clear, gold-green and fully present. For you, she said, and for me, because we are both the kind. He was quiet for a long time. Around them, the green field moved in the first morning wind. All right, he said. She nodded once, the gesture she had learned from him. Then she went back to checking the soil. He walked beside her and watched the sky come up, and the field hold the light, and thought about the particular kind of stubborn, ordinary, untheoretical grace that it takes to stay in one place and tend something until it grows. He had been doing it all his life. He had not known, until October, that it was something a person could do for someone who was not the land. But here he was. And here she was. And the east rows were green. And #production notes. Title *, Can a monster be a papa? The alien girl asked the quiet farmer, not knowing. Channel * alien girl, HFY. Engine * found family / misread monster / quiet worth revealed. Seed film, asterisk Chinese letter T Chinese letter Chinese letter Chinese letter. Shanty Old Master Q 1983. DNA extracted. Warm folk underdog dignity. Community gossip versus quiet worth. Simple man whose steadiness is the whole story. Pav asterisk third person past tense. Lead asterisk human male. Caleb Marsh farmer tilde late 30s. Alien female asterisk pale vessel 13th pale. Adult emerging Vorathi scatter refugee. Approximate word count asterisk tilde 9 700 words. Estimated duration asterisk minutes at 160 WPM. Tone asterisk quiet, warm, slow burn found family. No action sequences. Emotional weight carried through ordinary moments. HFY element asterisk human capacity for unconditional staying. The idea that choosing to remain is a form of recognition that crosses species. Romance level asterisk paternal found family. Zero romantic content, dignified and appropriate.